In 1997, when Texas Parks and Wildlife took over the bison herd from the JA Ranch, they brought those animals to Caprock Canyon State Park. They had people to take care of those bison. They had people to feed them. They kept them in a fairly small 100 or so acre enclosure. And they had excellent nutrition. They had excellent veterinary care. They had a really nice pasture to live in. It was a healthy place for them. And they started that population in 1997. And the first year, they didn't have any calves, or very, very few calves that made it, that were born and survived. And the implication was then, well, maybe it's just because we moved them and they're in a different environment. Next year things will be better. But then the next year, in 1999, they weren't any better. Again, very, very few, if any, calves were born alive, and the ones that did died soon. Something was going on. And then in 2000, the same thing. And then in 2001, pretty much the same thing. And the problem was, when we went and looked at the genetics of these animals, because they had been kept on the JA for over 100 years, males had been removed by various means, sometimes hunting, sometimes by castrating the bull calves. But the males had been removed so that not very many males were doing the breeding. And the population was really small. It may have been 100 at some times, but it may have been 25 at some times. So the population fluctuated quite a bit, but it was always really small. And with a few number of males producing offspring per generation, what happened was they started to suffer from inbreeding. And as a matter of fact, by the time Texas Parks and Wildlife took over this herd was in full-blown inbreeding depression. And when we went and we fertility tested all of the bulls at Caprock Canyon State Park, I think in 2001, none of the bulls passed a fertility test. So the problem was they were not producing sperm cells that would meet the requirements for fertility in a domestic animal. So we knew there was a problem. Then as a geneticist, I start looking at this herd and saying, well, at least from 1997 to 2001 or 2002, they've only recruited a handful of calves into this herd. And so a graduate student and I did a quick calculation of the average age of the bison in this herd. And most of the time, if you're replacing the animals that die with newborns in a population, the average age of a population will remain fairly constant. What we saw at this herd in the early 2000s was this herd was increasing in age, the average age of this herd. And it was going to reach a point, if it kept going the way it was going, and it looked like without intervention it would, this herd would fall into what biologists call an extinction vortex. And that's where you don't produce enough offspring to replace the animals that are dying. And the average age of the herd increases every year to the point that the majority of the animals in the herd are too old to reproduce. And that is what we call an extinction vortex. And that means that population, without some kind of drastic intervention, that population is going to become extinct. So we realized in about 2002, 2003, that was where this population was. We all knew it was a very valuable population because it was the last remnant herd from Texas of bison. We also realized with some modeling and with some research that we had done that this herd had a very high probability of going extinct by about 2040. So we had to do something. So the idea was, looking back at the history, in 1902, Charles Goodnight had sold 3 bulls to help reestablish Yellowstone National Park. And so I thought, well, man, wouldn't it be great if in 2002, 100 years later, we bring 3 bulls from Yellowstone National Park to try to do something about this inbreeding problem here in Caprock Canyon State Park. Man, that would be great. That would be a wonderful 100-year kind of story where that herd was used to rescue bison at Yellowstone National Park, and then the bison in Yellowstone 100 years later could rescue Charles Goodnight's old herd. Problem was that the bison in Yellowstone National Park have that bacterial disease, brucella. And there simply was no way we could take bison out of Yellowstone and bring them to this Texas herd because it just simply wasn't going to happen. So we searched around for the next best option, and there is a herd in New Mexico. It's owned by Ted Turner. It was a herd that was on the Vermejo Park Ranch. It's called the Castle Rock herd. And that herd was moved to that ranch sometime 1930s, 1940s. The majority of those animals did come from Yellowstone National Park. We knew because we had done some genetic testing in that herd. That was a very genetically healthy herd. It was a Yellowstone lineage herd, and they did not have infectious diseases like brucellosis. And so we approached Mr. Turner, and he agreed to provide 3 bull calves for Texas Parks and Wildlife to put in this herd at Caprock Canyon State Park. So we got the bulls. They were young bulls. We kept them in quarantine for a year because we were, cautious that we didn't want to introduce them to this herd too quickly. We wanted to make sure they were healthy, and we wanted to make sure that everything worked out right. And then in the second year, we just exposed one of the bulls to the cows at Caprock Canyon State Park to see what would happen as an experiment. And that one bull, I believe, produced, I can't remember exactly, I think it was 13 calves that next year. That was the most calves that had ever been born in that herd. And this was in 2005. That was the most that had ever been born in that herd in 1 year since that herd was established in 1997. We knew for a fact that this was going to work. And the fact of the matter is it did work, and it worked very well. So we used one of those other bulls the next year, and he produced 15 or 16 calves that were put in the herd. Then a couple of years later, we went back to Vermejo Park Ranch and got a couple more bulls and brought them and used them as breeders. And now, when we look at this herd at Caprock Canyon State Park, it started with 37 or so animals. Now that herd has over 300 animals. Genetically, it is much healthier than it was 25 years ago. That herd is completely self-sustaining. We eliminated that Extinction Vortex. We turned around the problems with inbreeding. And that is a genetically healthy herd. And it still represents the last remaining herd of that great herd that occurred, in the early 1800s that extended all the way down into Texas. It is the most southern part of that bison herd that lived in Texas and all through the plains in the 1800s and before that. So in my view, it's a success story. We took a herd that was going to become extinct. We knew that it was valuable, and we figured out a way to use genetic technology to pick a herd that was free of diseases and had the right genetics to bring back into that herd. So it worked. And you can go there today and you can see these bison today, and they're extremely healthy and they're doing very well. And every spring, there's a ton of calves in that herd now.